There's a hole in the bucket. And if you know it, you can sing along. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. Mend the hole in the bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Mend the hole in the bucket, dear Georgie, mend the hole. With what shall I mend it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I mend it, dear Liza? With what? With a straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, with a straw. The straw is too long, dear Liza, dear Liza. The straw is too long, dear Liza, too long. Then cut it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then cut it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, cut it. With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza? With what? With a knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, with a knife. The knife is too blunt, dear Liza, dear Liza. The knife is too blunt, dear Liza, too blunt. Do you know what it means when something is too blunt? It means that it's not sharp. So that's what that word means. Wet the knife then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Wet the knife then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, wet it. So this word is wet, and it's spelled W-H-E-T, and it's a different word that's different from the word wet, like water is wet, okay? So this word means to sharpen. So the knife is dull or not sharp, and so Liza's telling Georgie to sharpen or wet the knife. With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what? With a stone, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With the stone, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, a stone. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, dear Liza. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry. And now she's telling him to wet the stone with water. So W-E-T. Wet the stone then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Wet the stone then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, wet it. With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what? With the water, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With the water, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, the water. In what shall I get it, dear Liza, dear Liza? In what shall I get it, dear Liza? In what? In the bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. In the bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, the bucket. What's wrong with the bucket? It has a hole. But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. So after all that, there was still a hole in the bucket. The end.